If you can't get to the mountains, then bring the mountains to you with a telephoto lens. Well, it's been 4 weeks of lockdown here in Slovenia, and as you can see, my hair is feeling the effect. However, we can still go out. We can still go out in our local area and within our municipality, but we must avoid gatherings of more than 5 people. Now, one of the upsides of this lockdown is that it forces you to take a closer look at your immediate surroundings. Well, at least it did for me anyway. And it's also a great opportunity for me to show you in this video the many benefits of using a telephoto lens in a situation like this, and also a couple of the downsides to using a telephoto lens. Now, I've often walked in these fields near where I'm living, and I've always been aware that from here you can see this hill here, which is called Ljubljana, and also you can't see them at the moment because the clouds are obscuring them, but I'm hoping they're going to clear pretty soon. But you can see the Kamnik Alps from there, and over this way you can see the Pohogradec Dolomites, and this is usually where the sun goes down. But the problem is that from here you've got all these electric cables, all these rooftops and all these trees obscuring the view. And usually you can use a telephoto lens to overcome that. But you have to be in the right position. And this is one of the problems. Walking around here most of the time, I've often thought these trees are too high, these cables are much too high in the composition, I can't get a clean shot. And I came out here yesterday and I took a photo of the mountains from further over there. Now, it was a good clear view of the mountain tops, but I couldn't get Ljubljana Gora in because I was too close to those cables, as I'll show you now. Now, the problem you get from this viewpoint is that Ljubljana Gora is obscured by all of these cables, these electricity cables that you can see here. And because we're close to the cables, they appear much higher in the frame in comparison to the top of the hill. So actually the top of the cable is right close to the top of the hill from here. Let me show you. So what I need to do is actually get further back over that way, further back in the field, to distance myself from those cables and make them appear much lower in the frame in comparison to the top of the hill. Essentially, I'm going to increase the separation between the top of the cables and the top of the hill, so then I can zoom in and isolate the top of the hill from everything else. So as you see, I couldn't get a clean composition of Ljubljana Gora Hill from over there. And in many of these areas I felt I couldn't get a clean composition. But because of this lockdown, I've been forced to explore this in a bit more detail. And I've actually found a position where I can get the hilltops over there with the sunset, I can get a clear view of Ljubljana Gora, and I can get a clear view of the Kamnik Alps when there's no cloud. So it's not only about using a telephoto lens, but it's also about finding the right place to stand. So, from here, So now I can show you that from this position further back, as I said, the tops of the electricity cables are now much lower in my frame, and the top of the hill is now much higher. So what I've effectively done by moving back is increase the separation between the top of the cables and the top of the mountain. So from here, see, if we zoom in, now we can see where our cables are, and we can just move upwards to get those cables out of the composition. And now I've got a lovely clean composition of the hilltop. So you see, you can think of a telephoto lens as a big crop tool, actually, because what it's essentially doing is cropping out all of those areas that we don't want in the composition. Now we imagine, of course, that a telephoto lens allows us to zoom in close to objects, which is essentially what it does, but it's a bit of an illusion, actually. If you think about when you crop photos in Photoshop or whatever photo editing tool you're using, essentially what you do is you have a large picture, and then you crop an area of the picture and delete everything around it. Now that's essentially what a telephoto lens does, but it does it by actually cropping the angle of light. Now what happens is, if you can think of your hands, our focal length determines how much of the scene falls upon the sensor. So if you think of my hands as the outer points, everything between my hands, all the light between my hands, is going to fall on the sensor. When you increase your focal length, what you're essentially doing is narrowing that range of light. So if you can imagine, basically what it's doing, it's not allowing what's outside of my hands to fall onto the sensor. So it's reducing the angle of light. So it's essentially cropping out what's around it. Excuse me a minute, the light colours are nice over Ljubljana Gora right now, so I'm going to take a few pictures. I've got the composition set. Beautiful. Okay, so, but the thing is, when you crop an image in Photoshop, you're actually losing most of your pixels, because you're cropping out a lot of the image, and you end up with a much lower resolution image with less pixels. But the beauty of the telephoto lens, because it's cropping the angle of light, the whole of the scene is falling on the whole of the sensor. So you're getting a larger cropped image. So, for any of you who are not so familiar with the term focal length and what it means, I'll give a quick explanation here. This is an extract from my book, A Practical Guide to Photography. If you're interested in this book, you can find a link in the description below to the Amazon site where you can buy it and check it out. So essentially, focal length, if you look at this illustration down here on the bottom left, focal length is the distance between your sensor and your actual lens element. So you can see down here it's 50 millimeters. So that means that it's 50 millimeters distance between these two objects. That determines your focal length. Now most of you that have a lens are probably familiar with the term zoom lens. But what a zoom lens actually does is allows you to adjust your focal length. So you can reduce it or you can increase it. So if you've got a lens, for example, that says it's an 80 to 200, that means that you can adjust the focal length from 80 millimeters up to 200. So that's essentially what the focal length is. Now, the optimum on an SLR the optimum focal length is 50mm. And anything below 50mm is termed as a wide angle. Anything above 50mm is termed as a telephoto. So essentially when you go above 50mm, you start zooming in closer to your subject. And when you go below 50mm, you start stretching the scene into a wider view. So if we look at this illustration to the right, it's a good example of how this actually works. So if we look at this is our 50mm focal length, and what this essentially means is that between the left edge and the right edge, this is how much of your scene falls upon your sensor. And as you increase your focal length, you start to narrow this field of view. So less of the scene falls onto the sensor. And what you're essentially doing, it's a bit like cropping the photo. It has the same effect as cropping the photo. If we go back, here, what we're actually doing here is stretching. So we're stretching our field of view to include more of the scene. So if we look at the next page, this is a good example of how it works. I mean, if you crop your photo in Photoshop, it's actually the same. What you're doing is cropping your photo, but you're cropping it using the telephoto lens. You're not cropping the digital photo itself. So if, for example, if you take one digital photo and you crop it, you're actually reducing the image size. So if you've got an image here that's say 20 million pixels and you crop it to half the size, you've actually got an image of 10 million pixels. But when you use a telephoto lens, what you're actually doing is kind of cropping the angle of light, the field of view, but the whole of that crop is falling onto the full resolution of the sensor. So you're getting a 20 megapixel scene here or here or here, it doesn't matter. So you're actually cropping the angle of light, you're not cropping the digital photo itself. So basically that's what's going to happen. So at wide angle, this much of the scene would fall on the sensor. But if you increase the focal length, you reduce the angle of light, and only this much of the scene falls onto the sensor. And so the sensor records this bit here, which looks like this, but at the full resolution. It's not a cropped, it's not a digitally cropped image that is half the resolution, it's full resolution. That's the beauty of using a telephoto lens. Okay? Now, as I said, it doesn't look like the clouds are going to clear over there, but hopefully they'll clear later, or I'll come out here again tomorrow and I'll show you that we can also see the Kamnik Alps there, and we can do the same thing there. Okay, but for now I'm going to focus on Ljubljana Gora because the light and the colour is beautiful at the moment. Got some beautiful clouds, and I came out here the other day and I was stood over there and I was frustrated because the colour was much nicer. I had a view of the mountains and I was photographing that, but the light and the colour was much nicer over the Ljubljana Gora, and because I was over there I couldn't get a clean composition of it. But now I'm so glad that I found this position and I can get a much cleaner composition. Now, one of the downsides to shooting with a telephoto lens is that it can be extremely sensitive to any kind of wind or breeze or any kind of vibration, really. Now, one of the things you should do is make sure everything is nice and tight. Yeah, that's one of the first things. But even then, because of the length of the lens, and it's important to mount it using the centerpiece like this. It makes it much more stable. If you mount it from here, there's going to be a lot of weight pulling on the front of the camera, so it's important to mount it here. Okay, but even then, still, you know, this is a big long lens, and the slightest bit of wind, the slightest vibration is picked up by the camera. Now, this is a problem, of course, when you're shooting long exposures. When you're shooting long exposures, then the slightest vibration, even the minutest of vibrations, is picked up in your image. Even if it's a tiny bit of vibration, it may soften the image. The image may look a bit softer. You'll lose sharpness. Or if there's a lot of vibration, then you're going to get distortion. But at long exposures, it's going to pick it up. So when you're working in very windy conditions, then you need to use a much faster exposure. And that's not always possible when you're shooting at times like this. The light is low, and it's in order to get fast exposure, I'm going to need to increase my ISO. Now, the last few days when I was out here, it was quite windy, so I couldn't really do any photography this time. But now the wind has died down a bit. Okay, so really you need to make sure that everything is nice and stable, as I've just shown you. And one other thing you can do is, if you have a beanbag, lay the beanbag on top of the lens. That gives it an extra bit of weight to stabilize it. Now, unfortunately, I lost my beanbag. I left it beside a lake at night after shooting the dusk, and I thought I picked everything up, and it seems that I left it there at the lake. So I've lost mine, unfortunately, so I can't do it. Okay, so I either need to wait for the wind to die down, or I'll show you another trick. Whichever the wind is coming from, whichever direction, you can use a umbrella as a bit of a windbreak. Or if it's just breezy, then you can wait for the wind to die down. Now, one of the best ways to really make sure that everything has died down, you may think the wind has died down, but there's still some vibration. So one of the best ways to do that is to use the zoom function on your live view. I'll show you that now. Okay, so by using your zoom, pressing it twice, you can zoom right in. You can use this button to position it on a clear object somewhere. Make sure that you're focused properly. Okay, now you can see very clearly, if I tap, if there's any kind of vibration going on due to the wind, you can very clearly see that when you're zooming right close to something. So once you've got your composition set and you're ready to go, then zoom right in, focus, and the wind's blowing up a little bit, and when you're sure everything is nice and still, click the shutter. So that's Ljubljana Gora. Okay, now unfortunately the clouds haven't cleared over the mountains like I hoped they would. We had a lot of rain today, which was great because it cleared the air, because the last few days the views across there were really hazy, the mountains were hazy. Can you believe that over the weekend it was 25 degrees, it reached a high of 25 degrees, and then this morning it was snowing and the temperature dropped, plummeted to 0 to 4 degrees. It's crazy. But the advantage is that it cleared the air, and now the rain is gone and the clouds have cleared. So I've got some lovely colours over Ljubljana Gora. I just noticed that Stožić, one of the mountains of the Kamnik Alps, is starting to appear above the clouds. And again, from this position, I've got a clear view of the top of the mountain. I can cut out those cables and get a nice clean composition. zoom. I'm right in at 400mm focal length here. Beautiful. Well, as you just saw, one mountain peak from the Kamenic Alps has peaked through the clouds. This conical shaped mountain here is called Mount Storžič. You may have seen that in some of my other videos. I've photographed it often from various locations further north, far from here, but from here on the north side of Ljubljana and from this field I can also see this mountain. And again, from this position, as you just saw, I got a clear view, a clear separation between the tops of the rooftops, the electricity cables, and I managed to zoom in and get a nice clean composition of the top of the mountain with the cloud, layer of cloud just below it. And from here you get a nice clear view of Grintovec. Grintovec is the highest peak in the Kamenic Alps. And directly over there you see that peak and its surrounding mountains when it's clear. So I'll bring you back here when these mountains are visible, and I'll show you also from this viewpoint that we can capture a nice composition of this section of the Kamenic Alps. Okay, so this really is a great position, and many years I've been walking this field, and I've only just found it. And I found it because the lockdown forced me to look a bit harder, and I think therein lies the lesson.